Welcome. This week we're going to be talking about validity, and although there are other resources on the online Blackboard site, I wanted to go through some basic concepts with you. It's also available in kind of a different format, a different take on the same material and the old lecture. I'm re-recording this just to add in some more contemporary references and update a few concepts that I covered a little bit differently in the other lecture. So validity might be best viewed through a principal's question. And one thing that administrators often will do is ask teachers to demonstrate to them that their subject area is really covering what they think it's covering. We often find that in considering validity, we realize that what we're measuring, or what we think we're measuring, may be something slightly different than what we intended to measure. So for example, you say that your math course, or whatever your subject area is, English or literature or art, courses teaches your students to reason well or to write well. What measurable evidence can you provide that it actually does so? And I think this is the heart of validity. Does the measurement of the children's skills, what it is that we're asking them to show, really reflect the ideas, the content, or the construct that we're intending to measure? There are three key concepts in thinking about validity. And one is the validity, or is it what we're saying that we're intending to measure? Another issue that's associated with validity, and we'll talk about more next time, but isn't exactly the same as, is the idea of reliability. And then the third is usability. So to what extent are the results of an assessment or an observation or other kind of measure usable for some kind of a productive purpose? I think a valid question for you to ask is, why would I be bothered to think about these concepts? And I would challenge you to think about different kinds of courses that you've taken and the kinds of things that you glean from those courses. So, for example, I think back to certain undergraduate courses where I was learning a lot of content, and what I did, my strategy, was very much to cram for that knowledge level content. Now, did that provide me with the basis that was the intention of the course? I'm not so certain. I think in many cases we reward students who are able to comply and to deliver particular kinds of regurgitation, that knowledge level type of content. But we don't necessarily reach into the kind of core understanding or demonstration of ability that we want in all of our classes. So for example, in this class, although there's some content that I'll be measuring, in large measure, it's going to be the application of these concepts from your reading, from listening to the lecture, from participating in the online discussions, that will be the final kind of reflection of your ability. So the final project, for example, as you'll see more about, really looks at what is a good assessment, what are different styles, what are the different types of questions that we might ask. So why should you be bothered with this idea of validity anyway? Well, first, I think it's important to appreciate that all assessments contain error. That includes assessments like observations made by teachers. I think it's important for you to recognize what are the sources of error, so that as a teacher you can be metacognitive. You can reflect on what kinds of error may be present in what you're collecting about children, and to challenge the idea that your perception of their ability and your perception of their performance is perfect. I want you to understand that some types of assessments are prone to certain types of error. So for example, while a selected response item might be more prone to error that's derived as a result of a child's reading ability, teacher observations are much more prone to idiosyncratic differences among the observer. For example, if a student has really given you a hard time all year, it's going to be much more difficult to watch them and rate their performance in an unbiased manner than for the student who's always helpful. I think it's important to know how to build your assessments systematically and strategically to have less error, and how to measure that error and maybe be able to start to counteract it by using different types of measures. I think it's also important that you recognize what it is that you can safely conclude and what really falls outside of your ability to conclude based on your observations, based on children's performance on assessments. And I think finally, to really be honest and to be able to reflect on when certain types of assessments shouldn't be used or should be discounted when you look at those results. So what's a definition? Well, you've read in your text, I'm sure by now, and looking at some of the other materials that we have for our course, that validity is the appropriateness of how scores are interpreted and used. So scores aren't valid, tests aren't valid. It's the way that that information is interpreted and then the way that you use that information that has validity. So for example, if I took everyone's height and I determined your grades based on your height, it would be an accurate, a reliable way to go about it, but it wouldn't be a very valid way for me to approach that work. So we want to ask, to what extent does your assessment measure what you say it measures, and is it as useful as you claim it is? Stated another way, to what extent are your interpretations and your uses of your tests justified by the evidence that you're collecting about the meaning and the consequences of those performances and how you're using that information? So we're going to talk a lot more in a little bit about the consequences of assessment. And I think we can see those consequences around us. And so what we choose to measure is important, and then what we choose to do with that information is even more important. So a few important points here about this idea of validity. Validity is a matter of degree. It's how valid. Things aren't valid or invalid, but they are in degrees of valid. So for example, it would be extremely invalid for me to take your height and use that as the determination of your grade. It would be relatively valid for me to give you a 100-question test over the material and rank you based on your score on that test. But it wouldn't be perfectly valid because it would only be one dimension of understanding and one dimension of performance. It's always specific, to a particular purpose. It's validity for what? So for example, if I wanted to say validity for recalling information from the textbook, then that 100-question selected response test would be really quite valid or very valid. But if it were the broad understanding of assessment and concepts and I use that 100-question test, it would be much less valid. So it's a matter of degree and it's specific to a purpose, a specific purpose. It's a unitary concept, and we use 4 different kinds of evidence to help us make an overall judgment. So we talk about the overall validity of an assessment, but it's really the overall validity of the way we interpret that assessment. And it's based on some specific kinds of information. And we have to infer that from evidence that we collect. We can't directly measure validity. We talk about it by describing the information that we can observe. So, there are 4 interrelated kinds of evidence when we think about validity. First is content. Content validity is what are we asking children to show and to do? Construct validity. Do we know exactly what it is that we're measuring? Are we measuring mathematics or are we measuring reading achievement? It's not always so easy to determine what exactly we're measuring when we look at the types of assessments that teachers give. So word problems, for example, although they may be about mathematics, primarily actually measure reading ability. Criterion reference validity. So what are the kinds of outcomes that would be associated with success on an assessment? So for example, the SAT, and we'll talk more about this, but if you do well on the SAT, then one would expect that you would do well on your first semester in college. And so we see that that's the case, and so we say that it has this set of criterion-related validity. And then finally, consequences. Consequential validity, and to foreshadow, is what happens as a result of an assessment. Does the consequences for the student, does the consequences for society, for schools, for teachers, are they in line with what we thought the purpose of the assessment was and what it was doing? So questions that we might ask guiding our validation process. First, what are my learning objectives? Do my tests really address what I thought I was teaching? 2, did students' test scores really mean what I thought they meant? What might have influenced their scores? Was it growth? Was it our instruction? Was it the student's intelligence? Or was it some other factor, like cheating, or something else that happened as a result that really was unrelated to what we thought we were measuring? And then finally, did testing have its intended effects? Did we get students to study harder as a result? Did they learn the material better? Or did they wind up doing more nefarious things like cheating in order to perform well on the test? So asking really critical questions about our whole assessment process and thinking about the validity of it is the essence of assessment in schools. There is really no other more important outcome or measure by which we would examine our assessment procedures. If we've achieved a high level of validity, alignment between what we thought we wanted to measure and what we are measuring, then we've been very successful. But often I would argue that's not the case. So one of the things that we need to do is to consider the content validity. So for example, what is the achievement domain? When we teach, when we do classroom instruction, there are specific things that we want students to learn. For example, right now, I want you to learn about validity, reliability, standard error of measurement, and how to interpret test scores. That's the first part of this course. That's my achievement domain. It's a carefully specified set or range of learning outcomes, both content and the mental skills. In short, what are your instructional targets? Content-related evidence is probably the easiest way to establish validity for your assessment. So, to what extent do the tasks that we're asking students to do on the assessment provide a relevant and representative sample of the domain of outcomes that you're intending to measure? In other words, are the things that you're asking students to do on a test reflective of the kinds of real-world outcomes or measures that you would expect them to do? So in my case, I'm going to ask you to write perhaps questions in this course at specific cognitive levels. Can you write a knowledge level question? Can you write an application or comprehension level question? Can you write an analysis level question? If you can, then I would say that that's pretty solid evidence that you've learned this material from either from me, from the readings, or from some other purpose, but you're able to do it. That I have a high degree of validity that you have in fact mastered this skill, whether it's the result of this course or your own studies. In either event, you've demonstrated that you understand it. This kind of evidence is, I would argue, the most useful type for classroom tests, because when we look at our tests, we can think about exactly what it is that we're measuring on those tests and whether or not that reflects what we thought we were measuring. And oftentimes teachers, when they review the questions and they think about what students have to know in order to answer them correctly, realize that what they've asked students to do isn't necessarily exactly what they thought they were asking them to do. So one way to do a more effective job of choosing good content is to pick items and to review items using a table of specifications. So for example, here I have Bloom's taxonomy across the top. I have lower level questions like knowledge and comprehension, slightly higher level questions, application, and then on to higher level questions, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And on the left side, I have different kinds of learning targets, different kinds of content, if you will. For example, I might have art history and art appreciation. So those are fairly broad topics, broad areas of content, but they let me start to group my questions into these cells. And so that I can see whether or not I've asked an adequate number of questions of students that align to these different cognitive levels, that's Bloom's taxonomy, and to the different content areas. And I can see here I have a fairly good representation. Notice that there are more knowledge and comprehension questions than there are analysis, synthesis, and evaluation questions overall. And this is because the higher the level of the question, probably the more extensive the answer needs to be, whereas knowledge level questions can be relatively quick. So some important points about content-related evidence. First, it's an attempt to build validity into the test rather than to assess it after the fact. Second, recognize that your sample can be faulty in many ways and look for these things. First, do you have inappropriate vocabulary in your questions? It might sound like it's a good idea to make a question harder by introducing difficult vocabulary, but unless that vocabulary is actually part of the assessment, what you're doing is you're introducing what's called construct irrelevant variance. We'll talk more about that. But this is an important point because you've introduced something that is not what you thought you were measuring simply to make it more difficult. But what it's doing is it's not distinguishing between students who understand what you want them to and don't. It's distinguishing between students who understand that vocabulary and do not. Another way is that we can have unclear directions. Students don't know what they're supposed to be doing. We can omit things like higher order thinking skills. It's very easy to construct a test that has all knowledge level questions in it. We can fail to reflect the content or the weight of what we actually taught. What we find are things like the most recent things that we taught tend to be emphasized more on our assessments, whereas some of the earlier things that we taught, because they're further in our own memories, aren't reflected as strongly in our assessment. The face validity of a test is important in that it should look like the kind of test that students expect to take. Sometimes psychological researchers use tricks, if you will. They are really testing for one thing, but they make it look as though they're doing something else. This isn't a good approach in a classroom assessment because it introduces, again, what's called construct irrelevant variance, where we're introducing this other factor that students are now concentrating on and trying to determine which is the correct answer for them. It also assumes that our test administration and our scoring procedures are proper and valid, or at least accurate. So the next section's on construct validity. I'm actually going to break this video into two and stop here. This is the end of part one. Part two will pick up here with construct validity and go through that through the end of the validity topic.